Good day, everyone, and welcome to Media Laws and Ethics Part 2. We now go to the press, its responsibilities and excesses. The press as the watchdog. In a democratic society such as ours, the press plays the role of a watchdog. It is called the fourth estate with the function of fiscalizing the three co equal branches in a republican form of government, namely the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. When you say the executive, this is the branch of government which implements or executes laws. When you say legislative, this is the branch of government that makes laws, abolishes, and amends them. Okay? And the judiciary is the branch of the government which interprets the laws. Because of this function, the press has to be adversarial in nature. It has to report without fear or favor the shenanigans in government, the abuses or the malpractices of public officials, and how funds are being spent. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of America, once said that the press is a necessary evil in a democracy. And according to him, were it left for me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. A free press, as what Jefferson and other political thinkers have said, is one of the cornerstones of a democracy. Democracy cannot survive or will only be a lip service if people are gagged. The press should be the link between the people and the state institutions. Without a strong and independent press, the public will have practically no way of keeping track of what the government is doing. And while the media in the country today has done its job of safeguarding public interest, it has also its shortcomings. Detractors have listed the media's faults, including shooting from the hip, abuse of source based stories, resorting to poetic license, imagined or manufactured stories, conflict of interest, misquotation, and labeling. Now, when you say shooting from the hip, this is the penchant of some columnists to write something without first checking the facts or veracity of the report. These columnists often seek refuge under the doctrine of fair comment, although the intention is to malign other people. When you say doctrine of fair comment, it is said that if a comment is an expression of opinion based on facts, it is immaterial that the opinion happens to be mistaken as long as it might reasonably be inferred from the facts. Okay? But if the news item is unverified and not based on facts and it is malicious, that would be considered an excess in media and that would be considered as shooting from the hip. Alright? An example of this is during the time of Ramos, when one cabinet official of the Ramos administration has blamed the media for his ouster from the government. Next up is abuse of the source-based stories. Some reporters concoct stories to suit to their preconceived ideas or slant on how a news should be written by attributing them to anonymous sources like an observer, an analyst, or an official who requested anonymity. This practice is not only unethical, it is downright misrepresentation. Stories, even if they are interpretative, should be based on facts. The journalist who will engage in this type of creative writing will be exposed in the long run and his credibility will suffer. And say a journalist would say according to an expert or according to a scientist without really revealing who that expert is or who that scientist is, and then this particular journalist would claim that according to an expert, according to a scientist, COVID is just a hoax. In this particular instance, you would notice that the journalist abused the so-called source-based stories because this would practically be an inexistent expert or scientist because there was no revelation as to who this expert or scientist is. So that is, ladies and gentlemen, abuse of source-based stories. Now on to resorting to poetic license. Poetic license, ladies and gentlemen, or the freedom of poets and other artists to deviate from the accepted practices and norms for the sake of art, is sometimes being confused with writing factually. Journalism is the record of unfolding events. It should not be equated with fiction or other literary forms. But the late columnist Luis Beltran realized this a little late after the then President Aquino filed a libel suit against him for writing in his column while he was still with the Philippines Daily Star that at the height of the August 1987 coup d'etat, President Aquino hid under her bed in her Arligre residence. Beltran's remarks so angered the president that she did an unpresidential act by inviting Malacanang newsmen to her bedroom to show them that there was definitely no space under her bed where she could have hidden. Beltran later apologized, saying that he was merely writing figuratively and that he did not mean to hurt the president's feelings. Beltran was found guilty by the Manila Regional Trial Court Judge Ramon Macasiar, but the decision was later overturned by the Court of Appeals, exonerating Beltran and star publisher Maxino Soliven. Next up is imagined or manufactured stories. The most famous or infamous example of this kind of writing was the sensational account entitled Jimmy's World, a story about an 8-year-old heroin addict which won for the writer or author Janet Cook and the Washington Post, the paper where it was published, the Pulitzer Prize for Enterprise reporting in 1981. Cook later on was caught lying and forced to admit that Jimmy was fictitious and all the accounts that she had written about him were invented. Because of this, she was fired from her job and the paper forced to return the Pulitzer Prize. Another example was a story about Edwin Byron, a male nurse in Bukidnon who was reported to be pregnant. The story, which was first published in 1992 of June in the Daily Inquirer and picked up later by the other major dailies, turned out to be a hoax. The Philippine Journalism Review scored the dailies for not double-checking the facts of an incredible story like that of Byron. Next is conflict of interest. Columnists who are expected to champion the people's cause should have no other interest than to serve the public. But this is not what had happened. The late columnist Arturo Borjal of the Philippine Daily Star continued to write his column despite having accepted the position of sectoral representative for the handicapped at the House of Representatives. Some of his colleagues in the position or in the profession wondered aloud how Borjal could be objective when he was already part of the establishment. Today, a number of senators and congressmen are actually writing columns in the major stars. My position in this one is I think this is really conflict of interest because no matter how we delineate their position, it will always go down to them being in that particular position. So now on to misquotation. Oftentimes, officials or news personalities complain that they have been misquoted by reporters. Racing against the deadline, this happens inevitably. But most officials do not really bother about this for as long as the facts are not twisted and the reports do not harm their reputation or honor. Former U.S. envoy to Manila Nicholas Platt said that he would rather be misquoted 1,000 times under a democratic society than be quoted correctly only once in a totalitarian state. Platt's spokesperson and U.S. Embassy Director for Public Affairs Stanley Schranger once told Luis Fortuna of the Daily Globe that I don't mind what you write about me, but please spell my name correctly. Fortuna actually misspelled Schranger's name in one of his stories. Now, finally, labeling. This is the habit of journalists to put a label or tag on persons or organizations. Example is calling the Kilusang Mayo Uno as leftist or communist, or the President Arroyo as American lackey. I hope you learned something from this lesson Next video will deal on the concept of ethics, the NPC promulgated Code of Ethics for Filipino journalism, and the concepts of libel, right to privacy, among others, and other limitations to the press freedom. Thank you very much. Amping.